The question is simple. Have any of the systems on my network been compromised? The answer is harder than it should be. Enter AI Hunter. Active Countermeasures has automated and streamlined techniques used by the best pen testers and threat hunters in the industry to create AI Hunter, a network threat hunting solution that does the first pass of a hunt for you to identify systems that are most likely to be compromised and scores the results on a scale from 0 to 100. You can then research those systems in depth with AI Hunter. Focus your valuable time on the systems that need your expertise with AI Hunter. Sign up for a personal demo today at securityweekly.com/ACM. Application security is hard when security is separated from your DevOps workflow. Security has traditionally been the final hurdle in the development lifecycle. Iterative development workflows can make security a release bottleneck. With GitLab, security is built into the CI/CD process. Every code commit is automatically scanned for security vulnerabilities in your code and its dependencies. Results are delivered to the developer in their native workflow for rapid remediation. Learn how GitLab enables DevSecOps. Visit securityweekly.com/GitLab for a 30-day free trial. Signal Sciences secures the most important web applications, APIs, and microservices of the world's leading companies. Protecting over 7,500 applications and 150 billion production requests per week, Signal Sciences Next-Gen WAF and RASP help companies increase security and maintain site reliability without sacrificing velocity, all at the lowest total cost of ownership. Signal Sciences' patented technology protects any application against any attack with integrations into any DevOps toolchain. Signal Sciences. Demand more from your WAF. Learn more at securityweekly.com/Signal Sciences.
Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. I'm your host, Mike Shima, joined by John Kinsella. Do you have a specific guest or topic that you want us to cover on one of the shows? Submit your suggestions for guests by visiting securityweekly.com/guests and completing the form. We review suggestions monthly and we'll reach out to you once reviewed. If you missed Security Weekly Unlocked last month, you can now access all of the content on demand, whether you registered before the live event or not. Just visit securityweekly.com/unlocked and click the button to register or log right in. And I even had a segment on API security, so please go check it out, as well as all of the other panels and keynotes for that. It was a pretty fun day. And that, John Kinsella, brings us to the news. I was going to start off because on one particular topic about the 25th anniversary of Lawnmower Man 2 Beyond Cyberspace. But unfortunately, not enough people have seen this hacker movie gem. So we're going to have to actually move on to, I guess, more relevant application security that's been happening the last week or so rather than 25 years ago. Shaking my head.
Wow. 25 years, I'm really shocked. I have to admit that I haven't seen that hacker movie, mainly because I didn't really consider the first one a gem, not alone the second. But yeah, where's my cane?
Yeah. So everyone go out and watch those movies. We'll wait and we'll be right back with the news. Thanks, Johnny. Time to roll the music and outro. Nope, sorry. We're stuck on talking about SolarWinds. So something that feels like it's going to last for 25 years is supply chain problems, as well as everyone talking about SolarWinds. In this case, I wanted to talk about Microsoft's response to it, and not so much the SolarWinds itself, but something pretty interesting. So the Microsoft, they did an internal investigation. They identified that, not too surprisingly, there was some malicious SolarWinds applications in their environment. They isolated it, removed it. But upon some further investigation, they identified that some accounts had been compromised, some employee accounts or contractor accounts. And those accounts had permission to view, but not modify, source code. Source code to either, they weren't clear on what the source code was, but it could be Windows, Office, anything within the Microsoft, massive ecosystem. But what was really interesting to me that stood out is that, and I'm going to read a little bit or paraphrase from this post, is that they have what they call an inner source approach. That basically means an open source software development best practices and open source like culture, which means they don't rely on the secrecy of the source code for the security of the products. And I think this is a really good thing to highlight. It calls back to, for those of you with a crypto background, Kirchhoff's principle, that the security of a system shouldn't be weakened by knowledge of the system. And I just thought this was kind of a neat thing to highlight. And I don't think we should look at it from a perspective of cynicism like, or that they're trying to hand wave away that some malicious actor had access to source code. I think this is a very legitimate way to say, yes, admit publicly someone did access source code, but that's not going to suddenly make things insecure. That's not going to cause our infrastructure to suddenly weaken just because somebody was able to look at the code.
We're going to talk about this isn't cynicism. Over to you, John.
Over to you, John. Our listeners know what to expect. We love you.
Oh, no. We're not going there today. And when I first saw that sentence, it did kick up the cynicism monster in me, and all sorts of thoughts about marketing and everything else. But I think when you actually take it within context, it's interesting. It's important. It's something we should all strive for. And this is sort of, if we go back and look at what your 11-factor model, where keys shouldn't be in your code and separation of all that type of thing. That's sort of the low-hanging fruit of this, which I'm positive they don't do. It depending on which way my eyes are blinking, it either sounds like something which is admirable to aim for, or it sounds like something that could be done without it too much effort. If you look really purely at, we're talking about security and crypto here, where my cynicism kicked up is if you're thinking about the larger, if you take that really narrow focus off it and think about, okay, well, product security, you need to have, just if you're releasing new functionality and you don't want to see your competitors seeing it first. So I think there's things around that, but that's not what they're talking about. So yeah, it's interesting. It's something I think, back to our previous session, previous segment, this is something sort of good to think about. How can you, as you're writing code, what happens if that falls in someone else's hands?
Yeah, and I think another reason too, I want to, and I know you're being sincere about your responses there. We're joking about the cynicism, but also the other thing to point out is that look at Pwn to Own, look at the Tianfu Cup that we talked about the end of the year last year, and just look at every time there's a Patch Tuesday. Everyone can go and reverse engineer the binary patches and discover, this was the function being patched. Here was the problem. It looks like it was a off by one. It was a buffer overflow. It was heap overflow, etc. And vulnerability or exploits often get created very quickly after the binary patch is available. So I think that's another reason I also wanted to highlight that if we over-index on protecting our source code or saying that, source code is out there, it will now be tons of vulnerabilities, I think that evidence doesn't really support that statement when we already have binaries, and with those binaries, attackers or researchers, to be fair, can find flaws. So that's why I wanted to highlight that as I think a really interesting thing to emphasize. And if we're going to talk about threat models, as we often do within this podcast, let's make sure we address them. Let's try to put them within a good context. And I think that's what the real good context for me, at least, is that okay, it's bad that somebody got compromised an account, but there's no elevation of risk really now that source code is visible or was visible.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few ongoing campaigns, excuse me, out there that I don't think we've given a ton of attention, where there's folks that are actually going and finding open. I can't remember which product, but one of the Git repos that are open on the internet, not properly secured, and Intel's code has been caught in that. I think don't think Microsoft was, but there's a bunch of stuff like that out there. And I think really the point of bringing this up is I don't think we're seeing news of, oh my God, new exploits based off of those code leaks.
Right.
And in some cases, there's definitely obviously going to be, and in some cases, just going to, those of us who are bored might grep through looking for passwords or keys or that type of thing. But it's frequently easier to bang on the front door and see if there's a weakness versus actually trying to go through and read a few novels. So, yeah.
Yeah. Now, source code might help accelerate some of that research, but it's definitely not a requirement for doing so. So, speaking of threat models, and actually also a call back to our previous segment about security by design or designing things securely, our good friends over at drsec, we had Clint on quite a while ago, but he and a colleague wrote up basically a risk analysis of Kubernetes clusters. Now, I do want to make sure I admit out of the bat, not trying to turn this into Kubernetes Security Weekly, because then we'll turn it all over to you, John, because I'm going to quickly get out of depth in my knowledge of my good in-depth knowledge of Kubernetes. But I wanted to at the very least highlight this as one of those examples of here is how to reason through a system. And then also there's some good actionable ways at the end about here's how to then harden the system. So I liked it just from that kind of meta perspective, let's call it, and something good to emulate, as well as if you are out there running Kubernetes clusters, more great documentation that I think is pretty applicable.
Yeah, and this was, I was excited when this came out. These guys they're both doing good things. So seeing them get together to work on this was actually really cool. I believe they're both ex-NCC, so they're used to, there's a style where us former consultants, we're sort of used to talking to customers and packaging things in ways, and you sort of see in this document a little bit, but it makes it's communicated in a way which is easier for folks to sort of grab and consume and make useful in their organization. So it's not really long. It's broken down, like I said, in multiple pages, so it doesn't sort of hit you with this wall of text. But I think it's if folks are either running Kubernetes and now you're trying to figure out how do you secure it, or you're thinking about going down this path, this is probably one of the better resources out there to give a read.
Yeah. Now, so speaking of threat models and securing products or product security, I will also going to now pivot to Apple. So at the end of the year, Apple released a manual that's basically, what to do when, how to secure your iPhone or secure your Apple ID when personal safety is at risk. And this is another example, I think, of good communication. How do you make this accessible to the general public rather than relying on a lot of security jargon? And the other thing that stood out to me too, here is a way you have an application or at least capabilities that you've built within the iPhone or capabilities that support the Apple ID that can adjust to individual threat models. So rather than saying here's a one-size-fits-all and everyone needs to turn on the most locked down version of your iPhone that sacrifices some of the user experience, here's a little bit of a spectrum to do so. And here's why you might do so. Are you in a situation where someone has physical access to your device? Are you in a situation where someone actually has access to your passwords and you need to be able to safely and securely break apart that access? So I think this was a good example in that category of communication, as well as a product that hopefully can support multiple threat models and be secured for different types of user experiences. So that's that sort of trust and safety aspect is what I wanted to highlight from this.
You know what I think is interesting about this? It's funny. I saw this when it came out. I never got around to reading it, unfortunately. But just looking at the table of contents, back to our previous session, we were talking about not just threat modeling in general, but like what's some examples of how do you go down this path or think about it? I think if you just read the contents, the table of contents, looks like about 20 items, just thinking about either as an iPhone user or any mobile device user, and just sort of going through that, I think that would give you some things to think about, which are, one of the good ways, one of the things which I've always been a little jealous of, which I'm not that great of myself, is using analogies outside of whatever it is I'm talking about, right? So not so much specifically AppSec, but or not so much specifically around your product, software package, whatever it is. But hey, shared albums and photos, shared calendars. How do some of these other things where the functionality was brought out, which is designed to be used for good, how can that be used for bad? So I think that's it. That gets your brain thinking a little bit. It's a decent list. Not alone the rest of the doc.
Yeah, and I think you're highlighting near the end too to sort of dovetail with your analogies. One of the things that I like about how this lays it out is basic threat modeling. If you believe or worry about X, then do Y. So as developers, if you're designing a system, part of your threat models would be how might this, if you worry about your product being abused in this manner, then maybe we need feature Y or we need feature Z. And so that, I think, is also a different way that goes well beyond the OWASP top 10, or it goes into that very, very broad category of business logic. And business logic is sort of that catch-all wild card that's easy to just say and say, oh, yeah, we do some manual testing for business logic and whatnot. But business logic, I think, is where the real meat of the problem lies in terms of human ingenuity, developer, DevOps ingenuity, and that security and DevOps collaboration in the sense of how can these features be abused? And abused in a way that they are not so much use cases, but abuse cases or misuse, as opposed to very much technical things like an input validation problem or a specific type of vertical or horizontal privilege escalation problem that might be some more general, easy technical checklist issues. So another thing to think about.
But briefly on that one, that's a bit of a smell, right? If you're having to look at your business logic to ensure that you don't have some of these, at least some of the more basic AppSec type issues, I think that's sort of a smell. Cross-site scripting, if you think about a sort of model view controller, right, where hopefully some of that stuff gets handled as soon as you get that tainted input. And obviously you need security in depth, so you're going to need it throughout the stack. But I think there's, if I saw, a business function to, what do we have? Something about, there's a book up there about Trash 80. I don't know why, but we're shipping how do we keep track of the Trash 80s we've shipped? And if I'm seeing somewhere down in there someone working on an encryption function in there or using encryption, that seems like a bit of a code review smell to me. Like, shouldn't that be handled somewhere else within the platform? But maybe I'm stretching.
No, I think that's a good stretch. I think possibly stretching about getting good crypto on a TRS-80. I was a C64 guy myself, but I think what it sounds to me is you hit on that idea of architecture. The architecture, or you were basically just describing design and asking the question, wait, why are we doing this here? Which I think is a very legitimate question, because that's both the aspect of, are we doing that don't repeat yourself type of code smell, or are we doing something like, wait, don't implement crypto yourself, or this is a solved problem. Why are we solving this in new and different and possibly insecure ways? So good call out. I think another thing, so also another article that I pulled out on this theme of security by design, or trying to design security into systems, was Firefox was talking about storage partitioning. And basically as a way to prevent or really make more difficult a lot of anti-tracking, or making tracking more difficult. This is an anti-tracking mechanism. And they're basically saying, and what I like about this is, rather than adding a new browser header, a client-side header for all of the websites out there to implement, or, something about, hey, developers go and make these adjustments to one of the 3 or 4 or 5, I can't remember, different headers that control cache handling. We're actually going to look at what has been the pattern of abusive behavior in side channels in the sense of cache attacks or timing attacks, or checking the CSS color of resources to see if it's been visited or not. And we're just going to figure out how can we have a different client-side storage of these types of resources and put them on a per origin or a per site basis, so that cross-site inference, which is what user tracking is going to rely on, becomes much more difficult. So for me, this seems really elegant and a really neat way to address this type of problem at a good kind of fundamental level that gets rid of, I want to say gets rid of the problem entirely, but it's still early in 2021 and I don't want to be over optimistic. But that's where I think this is headed.
It's definitely a cat and mouse game. What's interesting about what you just said there is usually there was a bit of a mental, my mind ran into a wall. Usually if we hear cross-site, we're thinking about something bad coming next, right? Cross-site scripting, cross-site request forgery, cross-site inference. Somehow that's not a vulnerability. So that's interesting, I think, in and of itself. But yeah, this has a lot of promise. As a Firefox user, I'm excited about it. So we'll see how well it does what it claims.
Indeed. Now, I've got one more article that I want to save to the end. So, I'll hear the teaser is that metrics that indicate we're taking security seriously. So keep that in mind, listeners, and keep that in mind, John, as I do want to take us back in time. So this is why I wore my TARDIS top hat today, to two articles that we covered in January, I think it was January 6th, 2020. So basically that first episode of the last year, where we talked about Python is dead, and is basically saying, hey, it's 2020, Python 2 is going to be dead, so please remove it from your systems. So sort of as an thought exercise, or unfortunately possibly more relevant to certain organizations, I wonder how many of you have actually purged Python 2 from your environment, and how successful that was, given knowing that it's been end of life and now has 1 year past end of life.
The clicky of me typing while you're asking that was me going and running Python -- version on one of my boxes, and unfortunately getting 2.7.16 on it. So I know I'm using Python 3 in some places, but these things are hard to kill, right? Even for those of us who we claim that's our profession and we're doing all these things right. So can I hit snooze for another year?
No, I know what you mean, and that's why I think that's why we as a security industry are going to fail if we just say, secure your supply chain, keep everything up to date. Very easily said, but very difficult to do because, what's that asset inventory? And a little bit, my question to you is maybe be a bit more forgiving, is that, sure, maybe you do have Python 2.7.16, but does that touch anything? Does that touch a production system? Maybe we can look at this from a threat modeling perspective and just say, it's not as worrisome as we think. But the other thing I wanted to pull out here more as talking about this is that if you were able to do that migration from Python 2 to 3, or even if you did a complete, not even just a refactor or re-implementation from Python into whatever the language of joy is, whether it's Rust or Go or C++, because you're really, really adventurous. Would just be curious, what was that process that you used? And could you now reuse that? Because guaranteed that come 2021, there is going to be some version of Ruby, of Go, as I mentioned, or something else, a point version that's going to be deprecated, and you're going to need to move off that. So it's not like 2021 and was your one chance to update to Python 3 and be done. Sadly, there's going to be more things that are going to die.
Hey, you know what we could put on a little time capsule for this show in 2022? We can have a little discussion, see which one of us still has Flash on our computer.
That is good. I'm pretty sure I'm going to cross my fingers and say I don't, but I know Chrome for a long time has embedded Flash, and I haven't checked to see if they've gotten rid of it completely. Because I know that Chrome decided that Flash is a horror show, so we're just going to deliver Flash encapsulated with Chrome, and we're going to do the auto update ourselves. So there we go. 2022, listeners, I can't do the math, so it'll be around episode 180 something. Come check in, and we'll see who's got Python 2 and who's got Flash installed on their browser. The other thing that, as a visiting the past, there were 6 security team goals for DevSecOps in 2020. Now, this did use the term DevSecOps and instead of just DevOps with doing security, but setting that aside, I think these particular 6 things are pretty relevant. These are eternally relevant. And the things that stood out for me, automate all the things. Automation is your friend. That sounds great. It does highlight, what was I trying to say? Sorry. Makes security gains with policy as code. Now, I won't necessarily say policy as code. I'll personally generalize that into things like infrastructure as code that you can then run policy on. So are you doing everything in Terraform, and then you can interrogate your Terraform to see if it's against a particular policy or is violating a policy? Or even as we were talking about Argo CD, are there policy drift? Or CNCF also recently was talking about Kyvern, I'm going to mispronounce it now, Kyverno. Another policy engine for Kubernetes to make this a Kubernetes news segment. So those are some things I'll highlight as what did you do with your DevOps program? Did you set some goals? And did you get to any of them? And if not, 2021 is a great time to start. So, and I think that is going to bring us around to what hopefully will be an interesting conversation here. 3 metrics that will indicate we're taking security seriously. Now, the metrics here, they were sort of, they weren't quite tongue-in-cheek, and they weren't presented as prescriptive metrics as that we expect this is what everyone should be doing. But article by Daniel Miesler, who said, and I just lost the what the metrics, but it's basically saying, how do we know that we as a security industry are making a difference? How do we know we're actually doing better with security by design, as we call back to our last segment? And the metrics he was highlighting were, what are the fines issued to companies because of their insecure software? Or have we seen employees fired for ignoring security rules? Think of that insider threat or abusing insider, abusing privileged access to systems. And have we seen any executives serving jail time for security breaches? And so I thought this was kind of interesting, just in the sense of not necessarily what those metrics were, and that's not what the article was saying. It's just sort of saying, taking stock to say, cool, the security industry has been around for 25 years. If you've been watching Lawnmower Man 2, what has cybersecurity? What improvements have we done? And maybe to give you throw it over to you, John, as your analogy is, as you like to walk through, walk by locks and kind of jiggle the handle or test it with a lockpick. Do those locks get any easier, or harder, I should say, or more difficult to break into?
I'm going to answer that in a sort of by what I've been doing the last few weeks, which is watching a lot of YouTube. So first, I want to give a shout out to Adrian Snabria and Haroon Mehr. These guys did in October 2019 probably one of the I'm going to say it, probably one of the best security talks I've seen in quite a while. It was a keynote address for it's a virus bulletin in London 2019, the security products we deserve. And I can't figure out where how it got on my radar about the week before Christmas, but it's a little bit longer version of this metrics. And while this is, I think people will take this in tongue in cheek. This is super serious. And I think what's interesting about that talk is it talks about, why the security industry is the way it is, right? And I'm not going to steal the thunder. I think it's really worth 45 minutes of your time. Is that what it is? 42. Really, really worth listening to. And the second thing, one of the guys I follow on YouTube, and I'm going to completely forget his name, so I'm going to go scramble now while I'm talking. But he takes things apart. It's not Ave. Damn it. But one of the things he's been taking a few Christmas lights and stuff like that apart recently. And it's usually he'll go out to, he's based in the UK, Big Clive. I'm sure many of you follow him. But he'll find something super cheap off eBay, buy it for, £5-10, and then look at how it's constructed. And usually just, what can you learn out of how do you do value engineering and things like that. I guess you could say this is my IoT side being interested. But he did too, the first one, which it sent my wife running into a room wondering what was wrong because I was just bent over cackling. He had got a string of Christmas lights. And remember, UK is 240 volts, not our wimpy 110 over here in the US. He got a string of Christmas lights that on the plug it had the little fuse, which you're supposed to have on there. But when he took it apart, he realized that the fuse wasn't actually connected to the wires. So they had satisfied their requirements by putting the goddamn fuse into the thing. And that's the expensive part, right? But the cheap part of actually protecting someone's life by connecting the fuse into the wire so that your string of Christmas lights would be protected, hadn't gotten around to doing that. And he had another example which he opened. What was it? It was a fog machine. And the fog machine, again, something he picked off eBay. Why? I guess he has a thing for fog machines. Don't ask me why. It's a separate conversation. He took this one apart. And basically what happens is, there's a liquid that goes through a pump, goes into a heater. Once it gets heated up, it gets ejected as fog, right? Makes sense. But this one in particular had melted down for some reason from a friend, and there was a puddle of aluminum literally melted on the base of the chassis. And he's looking and trying to figure out what happened. And then at the end, you look back at the chassis, and here again, there's the fuse on the chassis with no wires coming off of it. And I think that's sort of, in many ways, we are the way we are in our industry, right? We talk frequently. I think I'm pretty good. I hope most of us are pretty good about don't do something for security's sake, but actually make something secure, right? You hear us talk about checklist compliance and things like that. And don't be on the front page of the New York Times. And these are a few sort of examples out there. What I'm sort of getting people to think about and hopefully get them to watch a little more about how do we, don't just put the filtering in for SQL injection or cross-site scripting as we've been talking about, but how do we make sure we're actually doing something that's going to protect people and save lives and not get people fired? So that's sort of how I'll respond to that question. Interesting article, but let's keep banging that drum and hopefully improving things this year.
Yeah, and I think it's funny that the security products we deserve popped up for me as well. And I just posted in a Discord channel because it was really good to see that idea of what has the security. It was a good self-introspection of the security industry saying, what have we been marketing? What have VCs been pushing? What products have we been building? And did they do anything, or why are they doing? What are they doing? And so great things to watch. And we'll bug you too, John, to maybe share that link to a great analogy about the Christmas lights and fuses that maybe aren't protecting us as much. That seems also, if this is the segment of analogies, that sounds like a great analogy of security right off the bat.
Definitely.
Wonderful. So there we go. So we have managed to once again start off the year and give all of you listeners some homework. So go watch some YouTube videos and join us in Discord as we chat. I want to say thank you once again for helping us kick off the new year by joining us and listening with us. I also want to thank John for joining me as well, keeping us quite entertained for our both segments today. And we will see you again next week on Application Security Weekly.